Well, I want to thank the Ohio Wesleyan University chapter of Phi Beta Kappa for the invitation to give this lecture and to meet with faculty and students. I especially want to express my gratitude to Professor Joseph Musser and Pat for organizing my visit. It's also nice to be here because I happen to be a Methodist myself, although I must admit the only battling bishops I've ever known couldn't win a soccer match. So it's an honor to be with you this evening and to explore some of the deepest challenges and the greatest possibilities that we face in our global age. Let me begin by introducing the framework for these reflections, and so what the title of this lecture is meant to capture by speaking of ethics in a time of many moralities. In various ways, shared moral problems are well known. Environmental endangerment, wretched poverty, worldwide trafficking in human beings, mainly women and girls, the selling of body parts, and on and on. But there are also shared values, or at least shared aspirations, to escape legacies of conflict, the struggle for justice and equality, the need to preserve cultural and religious identities, and the recognition of people often called shared saints: Mandela, Martin Luther King, Mother Teresa, Gandhi, and the like. Not only do people now confront these shared problems and aspirations, but they are also increasingly encountering each other through the mechanisms of global dynamics: media, economies, political interactions, the migrations of people. We're living in the largest migrations of people in history, and on and on and on. Not surprisingly then, in the last few decades, we've witnessed a variety of movements concerned to develop a global ethics that can draw on cultural and religious resources and yet move beyond narrowly confined religious or cultural convictions. Think of my lecture as another attempt at developing just that kind of ethics. The title of this lecture means to denote three things. First, it says something about our global age, namely that people around the world and from many cultures are interacting more and more. We are thus aware that our planet is the home to many moralities, that is, many systems of belief and practice about how one should live one's life. Second, the title distinguishes between ethics and morality, and we're going to need to get some clarity on that distinction. And finally, the title suggests that the task of ethics is to address the fact of global moral diversity. Later, I will note some current types of ethics and how they respond to our global situation, while I will propose a cosmopolitan ethics for our global time that treats the current scene differently than these other forms of ethics. My proposal is going to focus on what I call basic goods, the idea of conscience, and also responsibility. And I'll have more to say about those ideas as we progress this evening. One last introductory remark is in order. The position I will outline is linked to a specific moral and religious stance that I have come to call in various books theological humanism, which may seem oxymoronic to some of you. Contemporary forms of humanism affirm at least three basic convictions, which, for the most part, I accept. First, most contemporary humanists contend that we need to rethink morality with reference to human thinking, feeling, and actions, rather than some divinely sanctioned morality or some metaphysical claims about the grounds of morality. As Jonathan Glover has forcefully put it in a book entitled Humanity, A Moral History of the 20th Century, quote, "One feature of our time is the fading of the moral law. The alternative is to keep ethics afloat without external support. If there is no external moral law, morality needs to be humanized, to be rooted in human needs and human values." That too is going to be part of my argument, if not the whole of my argument. Second, humanism means a concern to protect and to promote the finite and inner-worldly goods of health, education, sufficient wealth to sustain a human life in this world. In other words, humanists are committed to the flourishing of human life within and not against other forms of life on our planet. Finally, humanists believe that while human beings share with other creatures a range of basic goods, we must also, and paradoxically, take a stand in relation to our finitude. That's the human distinction from other forms of life. I'm going to try to get at that human distinction later by developing the idea of the cosmopolitan conscience. Still, my position is theological, or more specifically, Christian and theological, in that I contend that religious convictions can and must commit us to the humanistic convictions I just noted. More will be said about that theological claim at the conclusion of my lecture. So, with those humanist convictions in mind and the theological point noted, let me organize the rest of this lecture, and given the time frame, I've decided to cut this down to roughly 4 hours. Let me organize the rest of the lecture around the 3 points noted. That is, I'm going to start with the distinction between morality and ethics. With that in hand, I will explore the character of moral identity and moral diversity. And then we can turn and really start the work of this lecture in trying to lay out a constructive ethics for our global times. At the end of the 3 hours, we'll have a Q&A session that can go for the remaining 2 hours of our gathering. So, moral diversity and ethics. We need to have in mind a distinction that will help make sense of this lecture and also what I'm attempting to do. The distinction is between morality and ethics. Morality is not just a set of do's and don'ts about actions, especially about sexual conduct. It includes some do's and don'ts, and it speaks about sexuality, but that is not all. More precisely, morality is the set of values, duties, traits of character that some community contends should guide how people can and ought to orient their lives and the kinds of people they should try to be. A Buddhist monk on this count has a morality, but it's different than the morality of, say, a Marxist or an evangelical Christian, each of whom also have their own morality. In fact, it seems impossible for human beings to live without some moral convictions because we have to figure out how to get along with others and also what it would mean to have a good and meaningful life. So everyone has a morality, even people we think of as immoral. For instance, Nazis or suicide bombers or perhaps Wall Street bankers more recently. The problem is that every morality claims to be true and good in virtue of something believed to be the grounds of the meaning of what is good and evil, right and wrong, virtuous and vicious, that is also itself good and true. Say, God, or the people, or a community, or a tradition. Given the meaning of morality, ethics is the critical study and assessment of moralities. Ethics seeks to clarify the meaning and the validity of some set of moral convictions and their claims to actually and rightly to orient human life. And this means that ethics must establish some standards for assessing moralities. We are doing ethics whenever we ask about moral convictions, our own or that of others, what they mean, and are they true? Are they valid? So ethics can lead us to say, for instance, that Nazi morality is, in fact, immoral, wrong, evil. Ethics might reveal that Buddhists have something to learn morally from Christians, and vice versa. But this also means that an ethics must clarify the reasons for what is held as good and just and right. And this is why, in a few moments, I'm going to talk about basic goods as a way to humanize ethical standards. Now, the fact that many moralities exist on our planet means that any ethics that hopes to address our actual situation must wrestle with moral diversity. And here matters get a bit more complex. Because human beings need to orient their lives in relations with others, their morality is basic to their personal and social identities. For instance, my identity is a bundle of more specific ways of identifying who I am. A white male, a fan of the Chicago Fire soccer team, a father, a Christian, a theological ethicist. But it's hard to imagine how any one of those attributes or descriptors could subsume the rest, so that I should be, for instance, only a Chicago Fire fan. Our lives are multidimensional and complex, increasingly so in the global world. And that too is part of the many moralities on our planet. One decisive feature of our global age is that human identities are internally complex. After all, there are German Muslims in Berlin, South Chinese Christians, as well as, at least theoretically, Hindu women who are cheering for, say, Italy in the World Cup. The reasons for this complexity are well known as well. The processes of the flow of cultural symbols through the worldwide media system, the global spread of the religions, and on and on and on. Of course, this is not a new fact in history. People have always moved around for various reasons, especially due to the forces of empire, colonization, and war. Still, a feature of global dynamics, as Arjuna Appadurai has noted, is the refashioning of traditional identities on a scale not previously seen. Now, this fact poses an ethical and religious problem. Is the complexity of our actual lives a good thing, or is it a problem? Maybe my identity should be unified under just one absolute identity. Say that I am a Christian. Any religion includes, as the religion students know here, include many things: rituals, stories, myths, leaders, communal organizations, ideas about how to live. Yet religions also claim, and this differentiates them from other social processes, religions also claim to be about what is ultimately important and ultimately real, that connects human beings to the sacred or to divine powers. For instance, a Christian holds that the living God revealed by Christ is what is most important and most real. Yet if a religion is about what is unsurpassably important and real, then the complexity of identity would seem to be a problem. It would mean that people's lives are wrongly formed if they are not shaped by what is unsurpassably important and real, say, political identities, ethnic connections, sexual identities, gender. On this reasoning, in order to be religious, one ought to fashion their lives under one dominant identity. One should only be just a Christian, or only a Jew, or be prepared to stand before Allah at the day of judgment as a devout Muslim. In other words, it appears that religions require that one's identity be unified under one category that designates what is unsurpassably important and real. My Christian identity must trump my cultural, my political, my ethnic, my gendered identity, if I'm to be faithful to the Christian faith. Now, if this is true of religious convictions, then how can one live in a society where the authority that backs one's identity is not recognized as absolute? How can the religions avoid conflict, since my Christian identity must be at odds with, say, your Hindu identity? Again, is it a good thing that people's identities are complex? And further, how ought we to live with that complexity? So, granting that there are many moralities on this planet, and that these are bound up with people's identities, including their religious identities, we are starting to grasp the full challenge that now confronts ethical thinking. How is one to assess the validity of any moral outlook, and how are people, if at all, to live with the complexity of their moral and religious identities in ways that respect and enhance the integrity of human and non-human life rather than fueling ongoing global-wide conflict that's sanctioned by their own moralities. This seems to be the reason why so many people think that religion is the real cause of social conflict. I'm going to be suggesting a rather more complex account. However, it is this feature of religious convictions, they claim to be about what's unsurpassably important and real, it is that feature of religious convictions that has convinced me that we need to humanize ethics. That is, rooted in human needs, feelings, forms of reasoning, and goods. And later we'll see what religious convictions add to that ethical outlook. But at this juncture, we need to clarify some ideas, specifically the idea of identity and its relation to moral and religious convictions. Clarity about that is very important for the constructive move I want to make. So next, the concept of identity. Now we're going to start moving in, doing a little bit of moral philosophy here, so I hope it makes sense. We'll have time in the question and answer period if it's not making sense. Most basically, to have an identity is to be able to be designated as someone distinctive from others and to be acknowledged as such. People fashion their identities in a number of interrelated ways. One way is to possess some attribute or collection of attributes, like race or class or gender, that enables oneself and others to indicate, to recognize, to identify someone as an individual or a member of a group. So if you can imagine a middle-aged white male college professor typing away at his computer and looking forward to a Chicago Fire game at the end of the weekend, then you have a way of identifying me. And I can also identify myself as that man. So first of all, social recognition and particular attributes are important in identity. Next, at a linguistic level, we identify ourselves with names. I am William Schweiker. You are designated by your own name and the names others give you. And this is important because in many cultures, names situate one within some family lineage. A name identifies an individual as distinct, our first names, for instance, and yet related, family names. But even that is not all, at least linguistically. We also use pronouns as linguistic markers of identity. I am me. I can say that I am myself, but I cannot say that I am you. But you can, ironically, say the same thing. That is, you can say, I am me, too. In other words, pronouns are reversible in our interactions with each other. We can each refer to ourselves as ourselves and differentiate ourselves from the another who is a you. We designate someone different in the very use of pronouns. What I mean by you designate by the term me, and vice versa. This linguistic fact shows us that there is something common between us. We can each refer to ourselves as individuals, but it also shows us something different. We cannot refer to each other in the same way we refer to ourselves. On the level of language itself, then, there is a human commonality and also difference. There's something more in terms of language use. Strangely, I can refer to me. That is, I can, in some respects, make myself an object of description. It is me who is the white male college teacher struggling with the computer. And I can, of course, make you an object of my description. Importantly, when I identify me, it is not always clear who that I is that is giving a description of the me. While I can make myself an object of description, in another way I cannot. Curiously, I am different than me, at least linguistically. I transcend me as an object of various descriptors, male, white, long-winded. Philosophers call this I the transcendental ego, whereas the me is my concrete embodied self. Given the reversibility of pronouns we just went through, I need to realize that you too transcend the various descriptions you give yourself. None of us, in other words, is merely the sum total of descriptions. Something about a human being escapes description. That is part of the reason Christians and Jews and Muslims in a related but different way believe that human beings are made in the image of God. Like God, there is something about human beings that escape control, escape exhaustive description, escape complete knowledge. It is why we are social creatures, but also something more. And as an aside, we might note that this fact about the human self and its relation to God as the divine image of God might mean that to humanize ethics is also a theological move. But I'm ahead of myself. Now notice then there are various ways we create and sustain our identities through the use of linguistic markers, the practice of name giving, and through social recognition. But there is one more way we fashion identities that is very important, and that is through acts of fidelity and infidelity. Part of who I am, my identity, is due to the commitments I make and to which I am true through time. Some commitments of love, political loyalty, membership in a religious institution, or more profoundly, religiously speaking, to God. My identity can be shattered by infidelity, either my own or when someone is unfaithful to me who I love. This dimension of trust or fidelity is important because our sense of the world, our ability to be responsible for our actions, and the nature and purpose of our social and political communities requires ways of identifying someone through time in patterns of fidelity. Acts of fidelity provide reasons to sacrifice wants and desires because those actions represent higher or greater goods. Who I am, my identity, is profoundly tied to my actions and my relations within which I faithfully or unfaithfully bear responsibility. Our identities orient us in the world and find expression in our actions and relations, and then our actions and relations bend back and help to shape who we are, our identities. Now we can understand why identity is so important to any religion. In the world's major religions, adherents are uniquely identified. A Buddhist seeks refuge in the Dharma. A Jew is part of the people of Israel. A Christian is one who follows Christ. A Muslim submits to the will of Allah. Whatever is common among the religions or among certain religions, it is the case that they are all very particular ways of life. If I say I am a Christian, that means trust in and loyalty to Christ and his way. I see and evaluate the world and others in a specific way. At least I ought to see and assess the world in a specific way. What is more, the religions form identity in just the way we've gone through. In some religions, one becomes a member through birth, through lineage. In religions that are not tied to blood ties, there is often the need for a symbolic or ritual birth, say in baptism in Christianity as a new birth into the church. Names are involved. God changes Abram's name to Abraham. Saul becomes Paul after his conversion. Adam and Eve name their children. A Christian is given a Christian name. In other religions, one can also be given specific names. Even the linguistic markers are important in religion. When asked who he is, God answers to Moses, I am who I am. But of course, Moses can say the same thing. He can say, I am who I am, but in a different way, because God is Lord. There is a non-reversibility of the pronouns. But interestingly enough, a Hindu, at least on some aspects of that tradition, can say that the deepest insight and liberation is to see that the I, my innermost self, and Atman are one. So too with the idea of trust or loyalty. One must practice the Dharma, one must keep the law, one must follow the way of Christ. Religions also have ways to re-identify people. They endow members with a new identity that is laid over or transforms their other identities. This religious identity shapes the way people see existence and conduct their lives. A Muslim and a Buddhist might do the same action, say help someone in need, and yet in an important and real way, it's not the same action. Christian love, to use another example, is different from others' acts of love because of the identity of the Christian defined by their faith in the Christ. What makes a religious identity different than other identities is the claim, once again, that it is about what is unsurpassably important and real. For a Christian, nothing is more important and more real than the God whose grace is revealed in Jesus Christ. For the Hindu, it's Atman. For the Jew, it's the God revealed at Sinai who covenants with Israel. This seems to mean, once again, that religious identities ought to trump all the other ways we identify ourselves, one's gender, family, politics, ethnic sense of self, and community. In this light, we now can sketch some of the landscape of contemporary ethics that I noted before, and this will allow me then to move to my own proposal. So with respect to the formation of people's identities around moral and religious conviction, some forms of ethics stick to the beliefs, values, and norms of their community and then try to figure out how to relate to others. The argument is that insofar as a set of moral beliefs and values is the condition for identifying oneself as a member of this group and orienting one's life, one cannot articulate and assess those beliefs from the outside. One must think within the languages, convictions, and practices of a particular community, say the Christian community. This is what is called moral particularism. This form of ethics usually focuses on the practices and stories of a community used to shape identity and thus the virtues that can and should be developed. In thinkers like Stanley Hauerwas and Alistair MacIntyre, in different ways, there's a deep concern with the specific discourse and practices of a community and the virtues members must have to live in ways truthful to that story and its worldview. In its extreme form, this can foster moral relativism that rejects any shared values and norms. One remains within the resources of a home tradition, addresses problems of identity from that perspective, while remaining agnostic about the possibility or even the desirability of dialogue. Notice, these thinkers want to have the complexity of identity organized around one set of convictions. For them, the complexity of our identities is a problem. It's not a possibility. There are other thinkers who try to develop a global or translocal or cosmopolitan forms of ethics. Granted that we live in particular communities, the point of a translocal or cosmopolitan ethics is that what makes moral beliefs and values true is not our local communities, but rather some more comprehensive outlook. There are different options here. I'm going to be outlining my own in just a moment, but let's get some others on the table so that we know what we're dealing with. So one could argue, as the philosopher Michael Walzer has noted, that moral communication always works with what he calls thick and thin conceptions of morality. That is, a moral outlook has some thick, robust sense of values, ideas, practices, and stories that sustain and are sustained by a particular community and are essential to its identity. Yet we also have some thin conceptions that allow the interaction among peoples. Think, for example, of the importance of the UN Declaration on Human Rights for orienting social life in our age. That's a thin morality. It's not a robust one located in some millennia-old tradition. Or one might argue that we can isolate the demands of justice without appeal to comprehensive beliefs, as John Rawls has argued. Justice as fairness, on his account, is political and not religious or metaphysical or comprehensive. An analogous position is found in the Global Ethics of the Parliament of World's Religions, which argues that something like the Golden Rule, do unto others as you'd have done unto you, and the Ten Commandments are found in virtually all religions and traditions. The idea here is that we can develop some standards of right action distinct from the beliefs about what is the human good. So now we have two general options that are playing themselves out as ethical responses to the diversity of moralities and therefore the diversity of human identities in our global age. One option is moral particularism, which argues that one must accept the whole bundle of a particular community's worldview, norms, values, and stories that make up an identity, and therefore identity is the necessary and sufficient condition of moral responsibility. In other words, responsibility follows after identity. Unless you have a specific identity in place, say Christian or Buddhist or Muslim or liberal Western, then a set of responsibilities will make no sense. So responsibility is dependent upon identity. The complexity of identities in our global time for the moral particularist is a problem. It's not a possibility. The second argument I've traced is what I'm going to call the separatist argument, which claims that one can separate a thin procedural ethics, like doctrines of human rights, from the thick, robust, and comprehensive beliefs that specific communities hold. In other words, in this argument, ethics has to pull apart norms and values used for the interaction among people from any worldview or morality that's connected with a particular community. This argument disconnects identity from responsibility, or it shows that general norms are also found in the basic beliefs of a specific community. Ethics must pull apart these norms and values and therefore disconnect identity from responsibility. And this is to imagine that people can act on norms and values that are somehow disconnected from their religious and cultural identities, or that those identities carry within them more abstract principles of right and what is just. So if the first option, moral particularism, makes a global ethics unimaginable in any realistic sense, then the second option, the separationist argument, seems to make a global ethics unlivable. It is hard to conceive how such an ethics could in fact motivate human conduct. Rarely, if at all, do people act on norms and values that are completely separated from their identities or only express part of their identities. Human beings struggle to live integrated lives. Now, noting these options in ethics, we've actually arrived at the third point I noted at the beginning of this lecture. That is, ethics must deal with the fact of moral diversity. And we have clarified the extent to which human identities and fundamental beliefs and practices are at stake. Rather than exploring in detail those other two forms of ethics that I've noted, I want to outline another option, a kind of cosmopolitanism, yet it gets at things rather differently than the other forms of ethics I've just noted. It works on two levels. A claim first about shared types of basic goods that come to reflection in human feelings and sensibilities, and second, the idea of the cosmopolitan conscience. These cohere with the broadly humanistic concerns I noted before about the flourishing of life, some account of the relation and yet distinction between human beings and other animals, and finally, a way to keep ethics alive after the fading of the moral law. So let me turn now to basic goods. Is everyone with me so far? Making some sense? Maybe not? We hope so. We'll plunge on, and we can bring these things up in discussion if we want. I'm trying to show you the complexity of what we all are living through and trying to think through, and also the ways in which religious traditions and ethical thinking have ways to respond to that. We're living in an extremely exciting but also dangerous time in history. And part of the responsibility of those of us who are in elite institutions, such as this one, is to figure out how we can help address that situation. So let's start first on what I'm calling basic goods. By basic goods, all I mean are those goods without which it is difficult to conceive of human well-being. Some of these goods are called by people like me pre-moral, in the sense that they exist independent of human choice. No one in this room chose to have a body. No one in this room chose to be dependent on your parents, although you are. Or the fact that it's extremely long. No one in this room chose not to be a social being. Those things exist prior to our choices. Other basic goods are distinctly moral in that they depend on human choice. Say, the kind of social relations we foster, what we do with our bodies, or the forms of meaning we create in cultural forms. All these goods can be articulated without appeal to metaphysical or theological backings because they are simply features of our human physical, social, and psychological life. Because these goods are needed for the flourishing of life, and their willful destruction or unjustified denial is destructive of life, then human beings, qua human being, have some claim to them. Now, in my account, there's 4 types of basic goods. First, goodness is experienced most basically, although sometimes inchoately, in the sense of pleasure and pain that motivate human action. We are drawn to what gives pleasure. People recoil from pain. This is the realm of bodily goods, as I will call them. Living beings, in fact, all creatures situated in reality through pleasure and pain, make some claim to be respected and enhanced, even if that claim can, in certain circumstances, be overridden. In other words, a kind of goodness comes evident when we attune to the dynamics of physical life. Bodily goods situate human beings in the world at the most simple and immediate level of sensible life. And yet they are also linked to other goods that have to be integrated. There is then also, second, a distinct realm of social goods. Human beings, as well as many other species, are profoundly social. Our existence is always and everywhere in relationship to some communities, their standards, customs, rights, practices, and beliefs, which communities develop to understand and guide life. These are social inventions, which guide the interactions of social life in some community. They include such things as family, economics, political institutions of whatever form, friendship, patterns of interaction with other species, and the means to act together with each other. I call these social goods to denote their relation to but distinction from other goods. Insofar as social goods must be protected, used, enjoyed, and distributed among a community, then social norms are obviously important. As social beings, we are moved by the desire for recognition, and we are vulnerable to patterns of shame. The bonds of our humanity come to rise through recognition and shame to give forth to a sense of benevolence for others as a standard of action. But these senses are also open to distortion. They're vulnerable. Racist policy breeds shame of one's very being. Sexism fosters hatred of one's own gender. Benevolence also can be stunted or deformed. Now, I've isolated so far the complexity of attunements to the vitality of life that arise in our own experience through pleasure, pain, desire for recognition, the dynamics of shame. I hope you all have had these kinds of experience. If you haven't, I would be surprised. I might suggest you should go get a life, but that's another matter. It's important to realize these arise at the most basic levels of our feelings, okay? They are not preached from on high. They're not something we construct out of nothing. They arise out of the kinds of beings we are. These feelings situate us in the world in terms of interlocking goods and evils that surround actions. They come to moral expression in sympathy and benevolence. They demarcate the kinds of vulnerability human beings face in the struggle to live and to live well, both as individuals and in communities. Yet third, people must also take some stance in relation to their bodily and social goods and the motivations that arise from finite social life. Reflective goods, our third type, satisfy not only the drive for meaning in human life, but also open the possibility of creating new forms and ways of life. These goods denote both a posture of interpretation and assessment of bodily and social goods, but they bear worth in themselves. These are the goods of a truthful life, meaningfulness, self-understanding, the goods of culture and civilization, or the whole dynamic of symbolic, linguistic, practical meaning systems. Insofar as reflexive goods denote a range of personal and social meanings, they are related to the reality of human beings as individual agents. How so? Pleasure and pain can and do move human beings to act without much deliberation. The desire for recognition and fear of shame can provoke action without ever asking whether those feelings are true or not. Yet human beings are also moved by the question of the truth of their self-understanding and the values and goals that orient life. At crucial moments, the encounter with someone suffering, the birth of a new child, revulsion at gross injustice. In such moments, we awake from the habitual forms of conducting our lives to ask about the truth of our lives and what we've held to be good and true and sacred. In other words, a sense of justice that arises, that exceeds sympathy and benevolence, but is also rooted in the density of our experience of being in the world as feeling, sensible creatures. Fourth, human life always takes place in some community, on some bit of earth, and during some time in history. Bodily, social, and reflexive goods, and therefore sympathy, benevolence, and justice, are always located in space and time. Human life, in fact, is intertwined with this fourth type of basic goods, the goods, well, I'm going to call them the goods of locality. This is even true of time. The many processes which allow communities to exist through time and pass on their ways of life, language, custom, social relations, are now endangered on the global sphere. The earth is precious. Our most basic locality is precious, but endangered. Human communities are vulnerable. These are the goods of locality. Our lives are marked by a capacity for empathy in the face of these vulnerabilities and forms of preciousness. This preciousness of the earth and the vulnerability of human communities as the space of life are often sensed in the homelessness people feel when their communities break down or are dislocated. The sense of natural beauty is an indication of the goods of locality, but so too the profound terror that human beings experience in the face of the titanic forces in the natural world. Not only pleasure and pain, recognition and shame, guilt and innocence situate human beings in their worlds at the levels of feelings and moods. The good of locality arises with feelings of participation or alienation from the various spaces, natural, social, historical, where human life takes place. The meaning of evil done or suffered, then, is imparted to meaning and destroying of these basic goods as well. The radical destruction of the very integration of these goods needed for the flourishing of life. And little wonder, then, that the most heinous forms of evil that we have witnessed over the last several centuries, fascism, genocide, sexual abuse, all of them aim to destroy these goods and their integration in life. It is on this level of reflection to dehumanize the victim through the destruction of the goods needed in some measure to live a recognizably human life. It is a violation of the imperative of responsibility that in all actions and relations we should respect and enhance the integrity of life with and for others. That is, we are now back to the problem of the relation of identity and responsibility. And in this context, I want to pose, as the second step in the argument, in our global context, the idea of the cosmopolitan conscience as a way to make responsibility the root of identity rather than the other way around, or separating them. Because if my account of human motivations we've just gone through is correct, then we need to figure out how to rightly integrate our lives and the lives of others. So the cosmopolitan conscience. We're getting close to the end. The idea of cosmopolitan reaches back to the ancient Roman Stoics, who claimed that someone could be a citizen of the world. It is now being revised by a whole host of various thinkers. We can note if you want, I'm one of them. On my account, human lives are always located in time, place, and community, so that the idea of citizenship of the world is a little implausible. In the global age, it is important to insist that while we might indeed understand the world as one reality, human existence is always situated in particular contexts and communities. And this fact gives rise to the multiple identities that we've already gone through, that make up a person's identity and a community's identity. A cosmopolitan outlook in a global age must mean the perception and affirmation of the ways other people's traditions and sources are inside of us. I am not so much a citizen of the world as the fact that the world's people have helped to form who I am in the distinctiveness of my identity. Further, human responsibility has gone global. And so increasingly, our freedom and power must be organized and guided by the imperative to respect and enhance the integrity of life with and for others. Our planet's endangered if we don't pick up this task. The point of a cosmopolitan outlook is that one's identity aims beyond itself in order to live freely and responsibly. And this is a human possibility, I'm suggesting, because of the dynamics already present within the formation of the worldviews and source stories of communities interacting on the global field, and the fact that we have these moral sensibilities that I've gone through. In other words, the scope of human community extends the boundaries of any specific community, whether it be political or religious, and actually reaches out to the whole community of life. One inhabits a specific community or culture or religious form from within this wider perspective in ways in which freedom is infused with a sense of responsibility. The challenge now is to be responsible citizens of the global age. The term for that stance in religious and social life is what I'm calling the cosmopolitan conscience. This form of conscience must be the touchstone of freedom and identity if social life is to have any future on this planet. The theologian Paul Tillich once wrote, and I want to clarify the concept of conscience briefly. Paul Tillich once wrote that, quote, "Conscience points to an objective structure of demands that make themselves perceivable through itself and represents at the very same time the most subjective self-interpretations of personal life. In my term, conscience, as the moral labor of our being, is the apprehension of the basic goods of life we've gone through as themselves making a claim on us to respect and enhance them with and for others. That is, the claim of conscience makes responsibility a founding dynamic in one's identity and the identity of one's community. The claim of conscience is the call from within the complexity of goods apprehended in the sensibilities explored before, that the integrity of life ought to be respected and ought to be enhanced. In this claim, this call of conscience as the term for the moral labors of our lives, the religions, interestingly enough, have found the ethical meaning of, say, the image of God, or the reality of Atman, or the summons to relieve suffering, or the task of being Allah's vice-regents on earth. Obviously, these religious claims are profoundly different, and so too their diagnosis of the human condition. The point is that religious traditions, each in their own way, commit adherence to what I'm calling the work of conscience, and thus place responsibility at the core of one's identity. Showing that to be the case is the work of what I call theological humanism, an outlook that I've just named in this lecture and which I would have to elaborate and defend at some other time. So the cosmopolitan conscience is a way of living deeply and freely within some culture or religion, mindful of the interactions between it and others that have actually helped to constitute a worldview and a source story, an identity. It names the way one freely and responsibly inhabits the complexity of one's own existence with respect to those basic goods and humanistic concerns I noted before. One has the responsibility then in specific situations to make choices of priority, not to unify one's identity under just one description, but for the sake of this cosmopolitan perspective, to note the point in which one's identity intersects with others. In some situations, I need to discern and enact how my identity as, say, a Christian is the means to help overcome conflict with other Christians, and there's plenty of conflict among Christians. In other situations, it is my bare and vulnerable humanity that binds my life to others in their vulnerability and suffering. This navigation of the complexity of our identities is not the denial of a specific identity. It is rather the project of integrating life with and for others amid the interactions we're actually living through and that have always and always will shape human existence. A person's or a community's form of life is thereby oriented beyond itself in ways that respect and enhance the integrity of life rather than contributing to its endangerment. The complexity of moral identities backs choices meant to fashion lives and communities that make possible the ongoing adventure of communal life, and in doing so, enliven the social good. So let me conclude now, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. I realize that much more needs to be done conceptually and theoretically to make sense of the idea of the cosmopolitan conscience, its relation to other forms of ethics, and the contribution to global ethics attentive to the range of basic goods I've noted. You'll happy to know I'm not going to give that defense right now. Yet the idea of cosmopolitan conscience, in fact, names the practice, it names the actual life practice of many, many people around the world who find themselves laboring with and for others who have very different identities than their own, different worldviews, different source stories, and yet they're able to orient their lives responsibly to meet shared problems. Those who do this with a special depth and earnestness become shared saints, as I noted before, Mandela, King, Teresa. They are living emblems of the cosmopolitan conscience. so that the history of effects of responsible lives is made real in their own actions. But whether saintly or not, the everyday and on-the-ground interactions among people are the only places in which the cosmopolitan conscience can live, can breathe, can be enhanced, or can be stunted. In the time of many moralities, there is the call to the responsibility for the integrity of life. The task of ethics, then, is to clarify its meaning for the orientation of human life for the sake of a living and humane future. Thank you very much.